have Camille Rudney, and she is going to be reading a statement prepared by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And then we have Morgan Britt, who is going to be reading the statement by Preservation Virginia. Both of these organizations have put Shockoe Bottom on the 2014 Most Endangered Historic Sites list. And that has been tremendously helpful because it has gotten Richmond on the international and national map, and it also has put it with the history, the stories of Richmond's history throughout the state. So this is a very important set of accomplishments that have happened over the last couple of years, and all of you are responsible as well. You have all weighed in, you have all made statements, you have all showed up at these different events, and the sincerity that you bring to this is tremendous, and I think it means really good things. It means really good things for Richmond. Go ahead and read my statement, and then we will go to Rebecca, and then to Derek, and then we will go to Morgan, and then to Camille. Welcome to Richmond, Virginia, one of the oldest cities in the United States. And as such, it's rich with history, and today it's also known for its fine universities, historic and cultural institutions, prize-winning restaurants, an innovative craft beer industry, a creative arts and recreation communities, its natural resources, in particular the beautiful James River. Some of the history is well known. Richmond was a center for patriotic ferment during the Revolutionary War and was the capital of the Confederacy during the U.S. Civil War. Less well known is its role in the U.S. domestic slave trade. Richmond's Shockoe Bottom is where enslaved blacksmith Gabriel died for death or liberty, while blocks away on Church Hill, Patrick Henry, an attorney who did legal work for Gabriel's owner, cried for liberty or death. Where in the 3 decades leading up to the Civil War, more than 100,000 men, women, and children were sold into slavery in the Deep South. Shockoe Bottom's 19th century grounding in wholesale slave trading made Richmond one of the most important industrial economies of the South. But a visitor to our city would not know that. Over the last 5 years, Richmond has commemorated the 150th anniversary of the U.S. Civil War. This sesquicentennial has been a significant self-examination of the key events of our history, but also key aspects of our country's values. We have begun to seek a deeper understanding of the legacy of the essential contradiction in our national identity, that the land of the free was also a slave-holding society based on a white supremacist ideology. But here we are, 150 years after emancipation and the end of the Civil War, standing in front of the Jefferson Davis Memorial at Monument and Davis Avenues, a city-owned monument that honors the slave-holding president of the Confederate States of America. Today is the first day of the UCI Road World Championships bicycle races, which spotlights the Davis Monument by making it the halfway turning point for the main races. The cyclists also will ride past the statues of Confederate Generals Robert E. Lee and J.E.B. Stuart to the east and turn past that of Thomas Stonewall Jackson to the west. The choice of Monument Avenue was deliberate and probably obvious. According to the race organizers, 3 main factors were considered when designing the courses: competitive and technical aspects, showcasing the best of the Richmond region, and the overall impact on local residents and businesses. Monument Avenue's architecture and statuary have ensured that it has long been considered one of America's most beautiful streets and the only city street with a spot on the National Register of Historic Places. And clearly there is funding aplenty for its upkeep. However, the monuments on the avenue were imposed on the landscape of Richmond and cities across the South precisely at the time when the rights of black people earned during and after the Civil War were being stripped away. Recall the 1902 Virginia Constitution, which denied the vote to almost all blacks and most poor whites. Across the South, public facilities were resegregated. Racist laws called the Black Codes restricted where African Americans could live, work, and worship. Defying these Jim Crow laws meant risking your freedom or your life. The 1924 Racial Integrity Act was a racial cleansing legislation affecting Indian and black people to this day. People such as John Mitchell Jr., the editor of the Richmond Planet, and a member of the city's Common Council at the time, fought public funding for the unveiling of the statue that began Monument Avenue, that of Robert E. Lee. After witnessing the unveiling in May of 1890, Mitchell wrote with painful farsightedness, "This glorification of states' rights doctrine, the right of secession, and the honoring of men who represented that cause fosters in the Republic the spirit of rebellion and will ultimately result in the handing down to generations unborn a legacy of treason and blood." The 20th century is rich with the struggles of people for civil and human rights progress in this country, and the victories have been many. Yet and still, when the massacre in that church in Charleston, South Carolina took place this very summer, people across the country understood its meaning, that our work is not done, and that we should not continue to avert our eyes when walking past these statues. We cannot pretend it is okay for our civic monuments, which are the public declarations of our values, to continue to promote admiration for the actions of those who would have held slavery and white supremacy as high and noble to this very day. Many are calling for their removal, and frankly, if a symbol of my heritage accompanied acts of terror, repression, discrimination, and declarations of racial supremacy, I would let it go. Let these symbols live in museums, so we don't lose the lessons of why they existed and why they were taken down. The UCI races, expected to draw a world television audience of 300 million, were organized by Richmond 2015, a committee composed of Virginia corporate and political leaders. The committee's chairmen are Governor Terry McAuliffe, U.S. Senator Mark Warner, Richmond Mayor Dwight Jones, and Dominion Resources CEO Thomas F. Farrell II. On June 23rd, the defenders wrote to the chairman asking them to change the route so that it does not include Monument Avenue, and they refused. On September 12th, the defenders wrote to this UCI International Committee in Europe asking it to use its influence to change the race route. We didn't think they'd change it. So here we are today to tell the world that most Richmonders do not support showcasing these monuments to Confederate military and political leaders during this world-famous sporting event. At a time when cities across the country are removing these symbols of the oppression of black people precisely because they continue to contribute to the nurturance of racism in today's world, it's an embarrassment that our city, which has not been the capital of the Confederacy for 150 years, would choose to highlight these statues to a world audience by making them the centerpiece of this event. What could we highlight instead? At the very least, the route could also have included the one black person memorialized on Monument Avenue who actually fought racism, Richmond tennis champion and anti-apartheid activist Arthur Ashe. Yeah. Visitors should know about Jackson Ward, the Harlem of the South, the home of entertainer Bill Bojangles Robinson, Oliver Hill, the renowned civil rights attorney who worked on the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case, Maggie Walker, the first woman banker in the United States, and the fighting editor John Mitchell Jr. But the route also has cyclists riding over the historic ground of Shockoe Bottom, once the epicenter of the U.S. domestic slave trade. This is where the process of changing the public history landscape of Richmond begins in earnest. Over the past 13 years, the defenders have played leading roles in successful community struggles to reclaim Richmond's African burial ground from its use as a state-owned parking lot, and a proposal by Mayor Jones and local developers to build a commercial baseball stadium in the heart of Shockoe Bottom. The group has also facilitated a very public 5-month campaign to develop a community-generated proposal for a 9-acre Shockoe Bottom Memorial Park and Interpretive Center. 3 days before the conclusion of that process, Mayor Jones suddenly proposed putting all available resources into a single memorial at one of the Bottom's former slave jail sites, Lumpkin's Jail. It's just a half-acre area, which, while significant, leaves the rest of Shockoe Bottom unprotected, including the African burial ground. The memorial park could be a 9-acre campus of beautifully and thoughtfully designed memorial and educational spaces, walkable, environmentally beneficial, and technologically connected to our city's wealth of museums, libraries, universities, and public schools. It can be a living site of conscience and a fitting legacy for this generation of Richmonders of all races and nations to gift to our children, for this will be their city. A Shacobata Memorial Park located within a day's drive of half the country's population can be a national site for truth, compassion, freedom, and progress. Protect Shacobata for future generations. Honor Black history, not Confederate shrines. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Before I introduce myself, I want to pay the liberation of Black people in this country, in the South, and specifically in Richmond. The movement for Black lives is a movement for Black liberation. And when we deliberately say Black Lives Matter, we are talking about the fact that for the bulk of history of this country, Black lives have mattered the least. So it is essential to raise up Black Lives Matter for Black people and for non-Black people. The fact that the very route of this race highlights Confederate supporters over highlighting the history of Black people and Black resistance is an enormous signifier that the ruling class of this city does not support the work of Black liberation. Further, the way this city is structured perpetuates the oppression of Black lives within it, where you see food deserts, schools that resemble and border the Richmond City Jail, where you see a lack of reliable public transportation and lack of access to quality employment, just to name a few, are all very specific to where Black people live in this city. And all this is indicative of the racist mentality that continues to permeate throughout Richmond. Black Lives Matter in Richmond, Virginia means improving conditions in public housing, ending racial profiling, the war on drugs, and the prevention of the incarceration of our young people. Living free from fear, from sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and the very real violence that is a product. Appropriately memorializing Black history in this city. Fixing our broken public school systems. Raising minimum wage. Creating reliable access to public transportation. Saying no to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and understanding that environmental justice is directly connected to racial justice. Communities creating gardens and feeding people, and finally, bringing structurally separated communities together. This is the work of Black liberation. This is what is needed in the city to advance this work. This is how we make Richmond a place where people can celebrate Black culture, and maybe even more importantly, where Black people can heal from the trauma that has been inflicted upon us for hundreds of years. Local organizing our show through several ways. Talk about this event. Don't let this movement follow the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, Virginia Raise Up, and the Defenders. And lastly, get out your phone right now, get on Facebook, and like the page Justice RVA. Thank you.
You're